Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast. Imagine a world in which we are in constant communication with all animals, and they could tell us what they were experiencing and warn us about potential dangers like a pandemic or an earthquake. You might think that sounds like the plot of a science fiction movie, but scientists actually say that world is not so far from our reach. Those scientists are monitoring tens of thousands of creatures using the tiniest of trackers and the immense reach of the International Space Station. Martin Wikelski is the founding director of the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior. He has been researching what is known as the sixth sense of animals for decades. His new book is The Internet of Animals, discovering the collective intelligence of life on Earth. Martin, hello.
Hello. Good to talk to you.
It's good to talk to you. This is a really, really interesting book. What do you mean by that, the Internet of Animals? We have the Internet, which connects computers. You have the Internet of Things, which connects all the smart devices in our house. What do you mean the Internet of Animals?
It's something that connects all life forms, all animals around the planet. And that is similarly powerful, or we think it's more powerful than the Internet and the Internet of Things, because we are linking the most intelligent senses that we have on this planet, and those are animals.
When did you start to think about that potential, that idea that, I mean, it's not a new concept that we're all connected, but that there is something that we can learn from that connection?
I think it goes back to the times of Alexander von Humboldt, who basically said 200 years ago that everything is connected on our planet and in the universe. And other disciplines have capitalized on that long time ago, physics and chemistry and radio astronomy. But in biology, we couldn't because we didn't have the technology. And that really developed starting maybe 20 years ago. It became much, much better. And about 5 years ago, now we can really do things on a global scale. And that's where we are sort of advancing towards the Internet of Animals.
And for you, what was the most intriguing possibility? When did you start into this world?
Well, I think I started in Illinois, University of Illinois. There were the two founders of radio telemetry in animals. Bill Cochran, who did that in the 60s, after Sputnik went up, he realized that he can build a radio and strip it to a rabbit or a duck and have amazing new information. And that is what many companies then advanced, and he advanced himself. But the key was that I think there was his mentor friend, George Swenson, who installed a very large array, this telescope array in New Mexico to look at the outer universe. And they together came up with this idea that, we can really link it all together. Like you can link the information from the stars, from the universe, and we just look inward on planet Earth to understand life forms.
You said in the book that we have a tendency in some ways to look to outer space and wonder. We kind of forget the incredible things that are happening here.
Yes, I think that's true, except for the indigenous nations. I think they had this notion about, well, let's listen to the animals around us. They know things, they have culture. And now we are learning in biology, there is amazing culture in animals. Culture is probably much more important than your genetics. And that is, in a way, a new development that helps us understand humans better, but also get back to the basics of where we are and what we are.
So how did you go about uncovering the Internet of Animals? You mentioned this idea of radio telemetry in animals. What exactly is that?
Well, you put a little radio that is almost like a Sputnik type thing. It just beeps. You put it to the back of, say, a migrating bird, a thrush in the Midwest. Then you have to follow it. You have to be with it all the time within a few kilometers to know where it is and what it does. But then with the advent of the cell phones and PDAs and now the iPhones, technology has advanced so much that we can strip the most important components out of those systems and make a wearable for wildlife, a system that really is something that the animals can carry around without disturbing them and really tell us what they're doing all the time.
A wearable for wildlife, like the smartwatch for a bird.
Exactly like that. And it has to be super small. I mean, for example, a wearable ear tag for a rhino has to be less than 15 grams to be able to really sort of stay in the ear and not disturb them, because the rhinos make up to 10 G, 10 times the Earth's gravity force with their ears when they flap them against their body. So they are amazingly powerful. And that's why they need very tiny ear tags. And that's the same for all animals.
Can you explain a bit more about how you do this? You mentioned thrushes, for example, tiny little birds. How do you go about tagging a thrush?
I mean, first you have to catch them.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, you still have to do that with a little net or so. And then you hold them in your hands and strip a little, almost like an underwear around their legs. So the tag sits on the back, on the rump. And then that is done within less than a minute or so. An nice elastic band around the legs, and then you let them go.
And the tag is tiny.
The tag can be really tiny nowadays. I mean, there are companies that make them down to 80 milligrams, the smallest ones, solar tags for butterflies. We have done ourselves 120 milligrams, 300 milligrams. It depends also how much is included. Is there a solar panel? Is there a battery or a capacitor? Or, there are lots of different versions. But overall, we want to have it as small as possible so not to disturb the animals.
This book has photos of you tagging dragonflies. I mean, I think people think that would be impossible. They think of a dragonfly, unless you have gigantic dragonflies that you're tagging. But a dragonfly is a pretty small thing.
Yes. And at the time, I was challenged by a friend at Princeton University who said, "Oh, you'll never tag insects." And then, within 2 weeks, our engineers had the tags miniaturized to a level that we said, well, let's try it. And dragonflies carry around their mating partners below them. So we know they can carry a lot. But we made the tags much smaller than that. And it seemed to work. And we followed their migration along the east coast of the continent. It was super exciting to see how they migrate. It's so amazing that all of this is invisible to most people, also to most biologists. And now we have a way to look into the abyss or the darkness of the earth where nobody has looked before. We have now a system, a macroscope to look at life on the planet. And that's super exciting.
So you get the tags on. And then, in the beginning, you were tracking birds by following them along with a car. How did that evolve to having an antenna on the International Space Station?
Well, it was super cumbersome. As you can imagine, you have one thrush that you tag, and then at 8 p.m. it takes off and you drive with it till 5 o'clock in the morning. And then, you have to drive all the way back from northern Wisconsin back to central Illinois. So it's absolutely crazy. But it was important to learn the novelty of the data that we can get by that. And then during that time, actually, it was Bill Cochran. We sat together and said, well, couldn't we do that from space? And he calculated it and said, oh, yeah, these signals reach up to outer space. 400 kilometers is not a problem. We could, if we were on the space station as an astronaut, we could, with my antennas here, we could receive the signal. And that's how it started. But then we changed and said, well, we don't want an analog signal. We want information being transferred. We want a new system. We want, the most powerful IoT, Internet of Things system that exists. And that's what we have now.
How did you go about convincing the people who manage and are on the International Space Station that this would be a good use of their time?
Oh, that was difficult. My God. That was the most incredible thing to do, because if you tell people that are doing space research that, we want to observe animals from up there, then they told us, oh, this is crazy. For one, we don't need that. And it's technically impossible. And then to all of that, we said, no, you're just not right. We can, we show you that it's important. And nowadays, everybody knows, pandemics start from animals. Ecosystem services rely upon animals. Our entire life relies upon them. And, somebody claiming that is not important is just honestly plain stupid. So that's what we convince people about now. And I think technology-wise, it gave us a massive challenge, but we had some young engineers that retrospectively, they tell us, we were so naive that we couldn't say no. We thought this is possible, and they made it possible.
But and you write about this in the book, going and convincing the Russians, for example, that this was a good idea. That sounds like the kind of thing that, people might not just say that you're crazy. You might start to believe that you're crazy as you're trying to go through this work.
Yes, that's actually true. But the good thing was, there are wonderful people in Russia. They know how important a large country is and how important animals are that are in this country, in the countryside. And the guy whom we convinced first was the guy who devised the re-entry system for Gagarin. So he was still alive and sort of the main instigator for this kind of technology in Russia. And he said, well, I have a dacha, this is important. I know animals. Yes, we do this. That was the beginning. And then, it deteriorated over time because the international systems sort of broke down in some way. And then, the Crimea was invaded. Everything became really difficult. And then the Ukraine war started and we just stopped the whole thing because we said, this is not what we can sign up for anymore.
I want to talk about what you learned through this project. And one of them, and I ask this because right now we're speaking in, the heart of spring. The spring migration is underway. Birds are on the move. You studied the spring migration. One of the things that you learned is that as birds are migrating, they're talking to each other.
Yeah, that's super exciting because we could, even in these old systems, put microphones on these little tags and we listen to the animals in the sky. What are they doing there? And you hear a lot of wing beats, obviously. You hear wing beat pauses. They just glide along. You hear thunder, but you also hear them talk to each other. So they call and then sometimes others call back.
And this is across species, right? This isn't just the same kind of bird talking to other thrushes or what have you.
Exactly. That's what astonished us most, that we say, well, yes, we track a Swainson's thrush and we hear Swainson's thrush calling back, but then we hear veeries and we hear other migrating species talk sort of on the same microphone. They are really close to each other up there in the atmosphere. And that was an amazing discovery.
What are they saying to each other?
Well, we don't know for sure yet. I mean, there's still a lot to be done to really understand animals. But at least we know that they know from each other, oh, I'm here and I'm going in this direction. Because from every call, you get the Doppler signal. I mean, what you hear, when an ambulance comes, it's a different sound when it approaches you than when it goes away from you. And that's what the birds know. They know where is a bird flying, where's another bird flying, and are there many birds around or is there nobody around?
How does that help us understand because the migration is one of those great mysteries of life, right? It's unclear what's going on, how they know over generations to do this. How does this help us understand what happens?
So biologists have actually thought this is such a complicated task, and animals do it alone at night, these little songbirds. So everything has to be encoded in the genes. And that's honestly very naive. What we know now is that they talk to each other. There is a culture of migration. They all learn from each other being up there. It's like a highway. You don't have to know everything on a highway. You just go with the flow. And that's what they do when they go between continents. And I think that's a major change in our understanding, in our perception of, how mass decisions are being taken. It's not by genes or by our heritage necessarily. It's mostly by the culture that we live in. And that also has massive implications, I think, for human understanding of how we are.
They also rest in that migration, right? Tell me the story of the birds resting on the ocean.
Well, that was crazy because we were going out to see whale sharks in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. Then I heard this sound and I couldn't locate it. Well, what is that? And I realized, oh, this is an ovenbird. I know ovenbirds, from central Illinois, from Wisconsin, from Canada. And there's an ovenbird above me. And then it came down. And I thought, oh, it's going to land on the boat. It didn't land on the boat. It landed on the water. And I thought, oh, this is one of those birds that died. And I swam towards it and no, it didn't die. It just, flew up again, but only a little bit and landed again in the water. I thought, oh, now it's dead. And then I swam up to it again and it took off and continued its migration. For me, that's a game changer in my understanding of how animals can cross barriers. Yes, usually they don't land on the ocean, but, if they are exhausted or if they want to have a rest, maybe they do. And that's where I also realized again and again and again that these little tracking tags, they tell us stories about these animals that we didn't know before. They tell us about the important aspects of their life, resting on the ocean, for example.
Just one more question about birds, because I love birds. Birds whisper to each other?
They do. We've actually heard that on the ground. They talk to each other without moving their mouth. I mean, they can do that.
This sounds like, again, something from science fiction.
Yeah. Well, they have a different way of making sound. They have this syrinx and they don't have to open their mouth or move their beak to make a sound. If they want to have a really loud sound, they open their beak and you see it. But if they just talk to each other, they just sit there and, they talk and you don't see anything. I mean, even if you're 10 meters away from a bird, you don't hear this. But if you have a microphone right next to that, you can hear it. And it's really exciting that, they have this sort of whispering to each other that nobody else can hear.
What else did you learn about how animals understand us and what they think of us in some ways?
Yeah, that was, I think, in the Galapagos, one of the most exciting experiences. Animals there are tame. And that's very nice because you come to their place and they also show you and tell you that it is their place. And we are supposed to, retreat and let the animals be the animals. And we just sort of are around. And we thought that we are biologists and we observe the animals. But then I realized after a while that they observe us much more and they understand how we interact as humans, but also how we interact with their kind. We had a sea lion being born there, and the sea lion was then gone after a few weeks. I thought it was dead, but then it had a really special voice, and it came back after 3 years, and I recognized the voice again, but it was already a young male that wanted to have hanky-panky with the females, but the big beach master didn't like that. But the beachmaster knew that he was not allowed in my tent. But the little one was running away from the beachmaster and apparently had realized 3 years ago that I had this relationship with the big bull. Big bull, stay out of my tent. I stay out of your female group. But the young one with a special voice just entered my tent, sat under my desk, and was super quiet so that the beachmaster wouldn't beat him up. And that told me that, this young animal 3 years ago had realized my relationship to this major bull there, this major sea lion bull, and used it in an emergency situation. Well, in a way, that's a little crazy, but why not? I mean, why should animals, what all they do is every day is observe nature, observe other animals, and they obviously observe us. And that's very exciting.
You mentioned the Galapagos. Can you just, since you're there mentally, can you talk about the rats?
The rats are some of my favorite animals because they are always funny. They're always up for nonsense. They are social. They're constantly working together on things. And we had about 30 or so rice rats. They're special rats. They are just on that island. They are related to some rice rats on the continent, but they have evolved into this new sort of life form on the island. And they are just playful. They also knew us individually because they treated us differently. I was the one that always sort of supported them, didn't do anything to chase them away, even from the table. So they ran after me, they ran over me, they sat on my shoulder and nibbled the ear. But I also had one that got a little too close because we always left our tents open because otherwise the rats just went straight through the tent material into the tent. But that one then came and sort of nibbled my behind and at night. And so I had to carry it away for a little bit to get rid of the rat eating me at night.
It sounds ghastly.
Yeah, it's a little wild, but this is just how these tame animals are. If they have no fear, they try. How does it taste to just bite a little human?
You read in the book that the sum total of the knowledge of animals is superior to the sum of any knowledge we will ever gather from human-made systems. How does that speak to that idea that I said in the beginning of the sixth sense of animals?
Well, I think that's exactly what it is all about. I mean, people are still debating, is there a sixth sense of animals? And I say, well, it's a physical law. If you have interacting intelligent systems, there's a new property emerging. It's an emergent novel property of, in this case, understanding the environment, understanding life. So there's nothing magical to the sixth sense of animals. And as we all know, if we have a dog or a cat or whatever, they know things that we don't know. They process things much better than a computer can ever do. And that means if they are interacting and we are understanding, we are tapping into this interaction, then we are tapping into the sixth sense of animals or of nature. Why we haven't done that in the past is a mystery to me. I mean, I know that indigenous cultures have done that to some extent locally, but now we can do it with these electronic devices, with these wearables. We can do it on a global scale. And that is absolutely amazing.
How should we be using that information? How should we be tapping into that Internet of Animals?
Well, I think it's important that initially we get the most important information for people out of it. That is, for example, forecasting pandemics or trying to understand whether animals can really forecast disasters such as volcanic eruptions or earthquakes, which there's some good evidence in meanwhile.
And is the sense that if we were paying close attention to those animals, that we would be able to have a better sense if a pandemic is coming or if an earthquake or a volcano is about to arrive?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we can now, in Qinghai Lake in China, where avian influenza is endemic, we can measure the body temperature of ducks coming through. And if that is elevated in a group of ducks, then we know, oh, the next avian influenza is on its rise. And then Chinese colleagues can go there, sample the genetics of that, and then we are prepared. You know, what is the next flu system that is coming? And we know this is then going to the west, to Europe, and to the east, across the Aleutian chain to North America. And, you know, as we have seen it this year, there's a global spread of avian influenza, and it hits mammals for the first time. It hit the seals in Peru. So there is a preparedness that we can reach through animal knowledge, but we can also measure the atmosphere. We can measure, for example, have our vultures in Bhutan, the snow vultures, the griffins, they go up to 8,500 meters altitude on their flights, and they measure turbulence, they measure humidity, the wind direction in those altitudes. And that's important because we need that to improve our weather forecast locally. Lots and lots of things that we can learn from animals already. And I think the most important ones are still those kind of questions that we don't even address today, that we don't know that we can do in 5 or in 10 or in 20 years.
Like what?
Well, I always give the example of the mapping systems, say Google Maps or Google Traffic. 2007, it started. Before that, we were just listening to the radio and newscast on traffic jams somewhere in a city. And nowadays, everybody uses their cell phone. And that's a system that before 2007, we couldn't even imagine that we would have. And now everybody is using it. And that's how I envision the Internet of Animals. There are things now that we can see that we will get. But there are many, many things that we just don't have any clue yet that, we will be able to have information systems in the future that are just really powerful.
It takes us out of a role as being the dominant species in some ways. I mean, we still are, but in that dominance, we have a lot to learn from the species that are around us.
Absolutely. And it also, I think, humbles us into really helping the animals, because once we understand how important they are, like in a guard dog or in a rescue dog, we would never harm these animals. We would always support them. We would always give them good food and shelter and everything, because they give us something in return. And if we understand that wild animals are the same, then there is a big return that we have to give these animals. We have to protect them. It doesn't mean that we can't use animals anymore in the sense of, there are too many deer and you shoot them, you eat them, you use their hides, like what indigenous cultures have done over the eons. So there's nothing against that. But I think it's the kind of approach that we don't want mass farming or these kind of cruel systems against animals. That's just not right.
Just finally, how has the work that you have done over the years changed your own connection to animals?
Oh, massively, because whenever you look, they tell you something really interesting and exciting. And even your pet cat, your house cat, tells you something. I think everybody knows who has a pet, a dog or whatever it is. But I think understanding that they continuously interact across species boundaries, that in the Galapagos, for example, a mockingbird connects to a marine iguana, so a reptile to a bird, and they warn each other about things. That is a dimension that I didn't know before, and that has opened my eyes into understanding nature and the whole life much better.
It's a fascinating book. Your work is really, really interesting, and it changes how we think of ourselves and how we think of the world in many ways. Martin, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Martin Witkowski is the author of a new book, The Internet of Animals, Discovering the Collective Intelligence of Life on Earth. He's also founding director of the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior and an honorary professor of biology at the University of Konstanz.